Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to do a full-on Akshan E guide. I did one 3 years ago, but I felt like I needed to revamp, and I overall just got significantly better on Akshan, so I feel like I have a lot more to say about Akshan E. So this is the new and improved Ultimate Akshan E guide. Now, if you want an easier to digest video, I still do recommend the 3 year ago video. I'll leave the video down below in the description. But without further ado, we're going to start. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chen. I am the rank 1 Akshan in North America. I've hit Challenger multiple times. I've hit 80-90% win rate with Akshan over numerous high ranks. And yeah, so first and foremost, we are going to start off explaining what Akshan E actually is. Akshan E is the core ability of Akshan. If you want to pick up Akshan, you need to be good at utilizing his E. So how his E works. I'm just going to read it. Akshan fires a grappling hook attached to the first terrain hits. Second cast, he swings around the terrain, dealing damage. Third cast, he dives off, firing a final shot. Cool things to know about this ability. First off, it collides with enemies and terrain. Second of all, takedowns refresh this ability, right? So basically how this works, your first cast is you are throwing a hook onto a terrain. For example, if you throw it onto no terrain, it's not going to allow your second and third cast. That's your first cast. Second cast is where you actually swing. Third cast is where you hop off. So as you saw there, I chose which direction to hop off. I'll do it again. First cast, second cast, third cast. My mouse, I clicked here, right? That's very important. To understand Akshan, you need to utilize all three aspects. The first aspect is actually deciding which wall to hit. The second aspect is deciding how long you want to swing. The third aspect is choosing when to hop off. For example, there, I didn't click anywhere. The game decided where I would hop off, right? Did you see that? As opposed to me clicking the third cast, I click here, right? As opposed to just hitting the wall, bouncing off in whatever direction. So that is how Akshan's E works. And now we are going to go over the first concept that you need to understand to utilize his E. And that is the circle concept. The first cast of Akshan, you throw it on terrain. The second cast is where the circle concept plays. So for example, I have a pen here. As you can see, ignore my drawing skills, but basically how the circle concept works is wherever you shoot, you want to draw a circle. For example, if I shoot a hook here, my second cast circle will look like this, right? So this is very important, and kind of understanding that and visualizing that is going to help you significantly play Akshan better. For example, if I hook here, my circle will go something like this, right? That's my full-on circle. So being able to understand this is useful in multiple reasons. For example, if I hook here, the circle will allow me to cover this whole entire space, right? Because that's a big circle. As opposed to, let's say if I do this, this circle isn't actually going to allow me to go over the wall. So my biggest suggestion, one, is to obviously, if you play more Akshan games, you'll kind of understand this concept. But two, go into practice tool and really ask yourself, if I throw my E here, what's the circle going to look like? Is it going to get me past this wall? If I throw my hook here, is it going to get me past that wall? Draw the circle for multiple spots. For example, here, you can draw the circle, it goes through, right? Vice versa, if you draw the circle here, it doesn't go through. Another spot, if you draw the circle, like let's say here, it goes through, right? Being able to traverse around with Akshan's E is significantly important to the kit, right? If I draw a circle here, it treads this circle that's already made in this terrain, so it's going to look something like this, and you'll be able to go through. As opposed to, let's say, like a bad E. A bad E would be, there's not really a bad E in this position. Like a bad E would kind of look like this, where you don't get as much movement, but generally speaking, you want to draw the circle, and that will help you maximize your movement and your damage. Next concept I want to talk about is the infinite E. I already spoke about how your E, you want to look into creating the circle to traverse the maximum distance, for example, this circle. But another concept you need to understand is the infinite possibilities of E. There is over probably a billion. An E right here versus an E right here, they make and are completely different, right? For example, an E here covers this distance, Whereas an E here covers this amount of distance, right? It's completely different. Even a pixel difference is a different E. So the reason why this concept is important is because really being able to play Akshan at the highest level, you need to fathom and recognize the different patterns and which E you need to utilize. Do you need a shorter E? Do you need a longer E, right? Like this is a longer E to traverse more distance. Being able to understand that there are so many different E angles and being able to practice which E you are going to want to do for a given situation. For example, if an enemy's here, right? Let me word it. I'm going to want to E and make sure I don't collide onto him. I want to cover this whole entire area to go past him or glide, through him, right? So the E that'll do that is here. Because once again, I draw the circle. If I E here, the circle goes through. So it'll look something like this. You see how I went through him and I fired 3 extra shots? As opposed to, it's a little, this E will hit him for sure. There we go. So that's what I mean. You see the difference in damage, the difference in mobility. That is very important to understand. So keep that in mind. My best tip is when you're VOD reviewing and looking into your Akshan games, look into what your E is actually accomplishing. If you accomplish like a bad E like I just did there, try next time to fish for a better E like this, right? So that is very important to look. Okay, that was a bad E, but try to look for what you can maximize like that and practice. That is the key. Next concept I'm going to talk about is the difference in E angles. So as you can see here, if a minion or an enemy is here, you're going to have multiple options of E's, and it depends on situation based on what they're doing. For example, if an enemy is here, if you want to maximize damage, an E here would do that. As opposed to an E here, this E is probably better in the sense that if the enemy is walking this way, this E doesn't cover, right? So generally speaking, drawing that E, making sure you do damage. Another thing they can do, and kind of to counter Akshan, is if you do go for this E, like let's say they are very healthy, but you still want to go in on top of them, and they can actually walk closer here to negate a lot of this damage, right? Because if they are placed here, let me clear. If they're placed here and they walk here, your E here is going to do significantly less damage. You see how you're not doing a single bullet? So keep in mind that there are different E angles. Whenever you are looking and fighting, ask yourself, did I do the correct E angle? Because there's 3. 1, 2, 3 in this instance, right? In this instance, where they're full HP, but you still want to go in, the best E to actually do is going to be here because you tread the waters of their body. So even if they're here, you follow them wherever they go. But if they're, let's say, low HP and you want to cover their escape route, then going this E makes more sense. Because if they're escaping here, you can follow. And then the third E angle is here. Now, another concept that you need to understand of Akshan is actually walking in preparation for where you're going to E. For example, if an enemy's here, right, and let's say they have dashes, the chance of me covering them is significantly less as opposed to having a more wide range. So the widest range I can get, let's say they're running this way, the widest range is actually walking in preparation to my third angle, which is here, and then latching on, and then let's say they run. You see how much difference in mobility I have as opposed to Eing here to here? I have a lot more mobility to catch them, a lot more uptime, and then no matter how many dashes they have, you're going to be able to catch them. So keep that in mind. There's just basically a lot of E angles, and this is even more important in the river, where there's a bunch of E angles here, here, whatever E you want to do. Keep that in mind that there are a lot of angles, right? And they do cause different outcomes. So you're going to want to practice understanding that concept. Basically ask yourself, what do you need more? Do you need mobility more? Do you need the damage more? Next concept that I want to talk about is how to use Akshan's E. So E is very important to use because it is his main ability to do damage. As you can see, this is going to be a general laning setup. Now, when you E here, you're going to see not a single bullet hits the enemy, right? Why is this important? Because your E does a lot of damage early game, and you want to make sure your E actually does damage to the enemy. So the reason why this is important is because your E actually latches on to whatever it first hits. You're going to want to elude that by getting a proc. So your passive proc changes the priority. Obviously, if you eat here, it would hit these minions, but if you autoed once, right, and had a passive proc, your E is going to, you see how instead of it killing this minion, it just targeted him? That's how you want to use your E. So different things proc your E. Different things proc your passive. So your Q procs your passive, your auto procs your passive, and ignite also procs your passive. So you could do a combo where you E ignite them and it'll latch onto them. That is how you properly use your E. Another thing to keep in mind is if you wanted to, you're only really focused on getting the mark. So if you, let's say this was a minion, you can Q through the minion to hit them and then E as well. So that's another thing you can do. The next concept I'm going to talk about is tower diving with Akshan. This is very important because, as you see in multiple of my clips, Akshan tower diving is extremely strong. Now, one concept that I mentioned earlier was the different E angles, right? Let's say an enemy's here. You have 2 different angles, 3 if you want to fish for the longest range. You have a lot of different angles. Well, tower diving, you only have really 2 ways you want to play it. So the first and foremost, generally speaking, you're tower diving because they're low, right? And they're going to be naturally sitting near or behind their tower. Now, which E angle do you want to go for? Do you want to go for this E angle, right? Where they elude a lot of your damage, or do you want to go for a more direct angle like this, where you do a lot more damage? You want to do the second one. So tower diving, generally speaking, a lot of Akshan's will just E onto the tower, thinking that's the best. It's actually not. To tower dive, you want to almost always want to E onto ledge, and this is true vice versa into top lane. Let's say they're hiding here or here. Instead of Eing to tower or this way, because these two are suboptimal, you want to E here and basically go all the way through. That's the ideal situation. If you E onto the ledge and go all the way through like this, that is the ideal situation. Now, let's say they body block you here, right? If they body block you here, that's when you have to change your plan and tower dive. So you can still do this E. It's still probably the best, but you want to hop off, Q, throw other abilities instead of just fully E in. But if they're not here, let's say they're here, your best bet is just to E all the way through. And assuming they're low HP, because if you're tower diving, they're low, you want to not collide and just go all the way through. So something like this, right? And then ultimately you get the kill and you're out. Another funny thing you can do with this current meta, you see how this is open? There's another way you can tower dive. Let's say there's minions here. Obviously, I can't mimic minions. I can probably summon an ally dummy so it tanks tower. This is, let's pretend this is minions. Another funny thing you can do, and you've seen it before, is actually walk close enough to where, once again, draw the circle. If you draw the circle like this, this is another way you can tower dive. Something like this. And you can just multiple swing. They're generally going to die, especially if they're low HP. This is another way to tower dive. That is new as opposed to 3 years ago. So that is how you tower dive with Akshan. Another concept with Akshan is going to be the E-Flash combo. This is going to be, it's pretty niche, but it is somewhat useful. Let's say there's an enemy here, and you need to cover a lot of distance. You're very far. Well, you're going to want to fish for a max E, and then you can E-Flash. You see how that did damage to him? Because the third proc, where he fires the final shots, that procs even if you're flashing. So my third proc was nowhere near him, but I can E-Flash, right? Like my third proc is nowhere near him, right? I can E-Flash, jump off, E-Flash, and my third shot will fire at him. And then you can follow up with Q auto. So that's a very niche thing that you can do. And it does help a lot, especially if you're chasing in the long run. To do the E-Flash combo. Another combo with E is going to be the E-R combo. If you press R and you try swinging during your R, you see how I can't? I was clicking there, but I can't. I'll do it one more time. R, E. While my R is shooting, I cannot swing. How to alleviate or bypass this is you R and you E, and before your R shoots, you E. So this is going to be your maximum damage combo, because as you can see, my R is firing, and then while I jump off, my E is firing, and then my autos are firing as well, right? Because obviously, while you're swinging here, you're not doing damage for like 5 seconds. But if you do this combo, you're still doing damage to them, and then you're still doing damage to them. This is your maximum DPS combo, the ER combo. So do not forget that it's very key that you hop off your E before your R actually channels and goes off. Another concept with Akshan is going to be colliding with E. So we've already spoken about like perfect E angles, but there are times where you will collide. So obviously, ideally, if the enemy is here, you want to go past him. Because if you go past him, you're going to do more damage, you have more mobility, you cut him off. So this is the ideal. But let's say either they body block you. So let's say this guy walks here, right? And body block you. Well, what happens when they body block you? Notice what happens to my character after they body block me. I jump backwards. So that's very bad in a chasing scenario. So what you can do to bypass this is you E, right? So that hits him. And then this is what you can do. You E, and then you can right click before you're about to collide with them to cover that distance. And so basically, if you don't do that, you end up here. If you do that, you end up here. And that does make a difference when you're chasing. So I'll show you one more time. If you E, you collide, and then you're sent basically behind them if they're running. And then this is with clicking. So if you're ever going to collide, just right click where they are going to go before you collide. Another concept of Akshan is going to be his infinite E-swings. Now, this isn't too practical. If you're just picking up Akshan or trying to learn Akshan, I do not recommend you trying this. But once you get more advanced, this could be useful. So this is going to be your infinite E-swings. So the standard E-swings, I kind of touched on during the tower dive. This is your standard infinite E-swings because your E does swing indefinitely, right? So these can be useful. Let's say you're trying to clear a bunch of minions and you want to infinitely E-swing. There's like a bunch of minions coming at you. You can do this for maximum DPS. You're just going to keep swinging, right? Let's say alternatively, you're like long chasing, or I've done these before where you just keep swinging and then there's like enemies and then you can choose when you want to hop off. That's also useful. But now how to do an infinite E-swing. This is basically like a glitch version. If you've seen these, you'll know what I'm talking about. Basically, you walk up to a ledge, and then you swing in place. Now, that looks cool, right? How does that work? So the key to actually pull this off is walking as close to a ledge as possible, right? And then clicking E, basically like make a cross, right? So this is the building, make a cross. So E would be here, and right-click at the same time. Something like that, okay? Now, cool thing about this is you can basically do it to almost every wall that has like this sort of like almost C shape, kind of. You see how this C's? It makes a C shape. You can do it here. Okay, that one's a little more bulky. You can do it here though, like that, and vice versa. So this is just a cool concept. It's a little bit more fun. It used to be practical when doing objectives, but they have patched it. So nowadays, you can just do it in the mid lane to either fast clear or just confuse your teammates or enemies. The next concept I want to talk about is bigger is better. So what do I mean by that? I spoke about it earlier, how you basically never want to collide with the enemy, right? Colliding with the enemy, your E, you want to treat your E as both mobility and damage. So if you're not in your E, you're in for a bad time. So almost always, the bigger your E is, and the more value you can get off of your E swing, the better. So for example, if I do this E, that's obviously bad, right? If I do this E, yes, I don't collide with him, but that's also bad. Why? Because I'm not covering much distance. You want to maximize the amount of distance you can cover, so a good E would look like this. You see the amount of distance I cover, so let's say he flash here, I can cover stuff like that, right? So keep that in mind. Almost every time you want to go for a bigger E, right? You want to go for long E's. You don't want to go for short E's. And I spoke about this earlier as well. Position your character to a way where you can actually maximize getting these E's. For example, if I'm chasing this guy, right? And I'm walking this way, I limit myself to how many good E's I have, as opposed to spending that time to walk this way to open myself to a really good E, if that makes sense. Right. So keep that in mind. Always go for bigger E's. Whenever I'm chasing, I will always fish for the maximum amount of length that I can hit, just so I have bigger swing, bigger motion, and bigger damage, right? Because the longer your E, the more damage you do. Look at the amount of damage, right? More damage, as opposed to this, right? Less damage. Last few concepts I want to talk about is going to be your extended E range. E actually has a misleading hitbox. So for example, this, most people would say it wouldn't hit, but it does. You see how like it it latches on and it extends your E range. Right here. Like, it hits here, but it goes here. So your E actually is a lot longer than a lot of people think. So, for example, right here would hit, right? It latches on again. Your E is a lot longer. So why is this important? Because, well, I just mentioned how the bigger E, the better. Like this, as opposed to, like, just the normal length, right? The normal length would look like this. That actually makes a massive difference. So I'll show you the normal length again. This is the normal length that people would go for. You know, that's just standard. My thing is hitting the wall, and then this is the extended E. See how that makes a difference? Nice. Okay. Last concept that I want to talk about is actually just getting practice E-ing inside the jungle. There's a lot of terrain that you think you would collide, but you don't. For example, like this wall, you think it'll collide here, but it actually kind of like curves almost like this, to where you can get really good. Let me get a good example. You could get a really good... You see how I tread through the terrain? You can do that in a lot of places. Being able to understand this concept is very useful. For example, even starting your E's, like this wall, a lot of people wouldn't feel comfortable E'ing over, but you see how my body's basically gliding past it? You can utilize that to make a lot of big E swings. You see how this, it almost looked like it hit the rock, but it doesn't. Like my body's literally on top of it, but keep that in mind. It is very forgiving, so practice. And also, last concept is the hitbox on E as well is very wonky. So if you E here, the hitbox is very wonky, so just practice with your E. Go into practice tool, see what E's you can do and can't do, and get a feel for the champion. Anyways, that is it for the E guide. Hopefully you guys found this guide helpful. Let me know down in the comments below. If you have any questions, I will be free to answer. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Catch you in the next video.